Imagine waking up in a small farming village in central Japan sometime in the late 1400s. The morning is calm. Rice seedlings sway gently in the paddies, smoke rises from cooking fires. Then, in the distance, a temple bell begins to ring, not the slow, familiar rhythm of a morning prayer, but a fast, frantic clang that everyone in the village instantly recognizes. Someone has spotted movement on the road. An army is coming, and no one in your village knows whose army it is, which lord it serves, or what will happen when it arrives. You have no idea if these soldiers will pass through peacefully, demand your entire rice harvest as tribute, burn your home to deny shelter to an enemy, or drag every able-bodied man in the village off to fight in a war that has nothing to do with any of you. This was not a rare one-time event. For nearly a century and a half, this uncertainty was simply what life felt like in Japan. Today, when we think about fear, we usually think about deadlines, bad news alerts, or arguments with people we love. Our stress is real, but it rarely threatens our home, our land, or our life in a single afternoon. For an ordinary villager living through Japan's Sengoku period, the fear did not come from an earthquake, a typhoon, or a freezing winter. It came from other human beings, armies, lords, betrayals, and it never fully went away. The Sengoku period is generally dated from 1467 to 1603, though some historians extend it to 1615. It began with the Onin War, a devastating civil conflict that broke out in 1467 and burned much of the capital city of Kyoto to the ground over roughly a decade of fighting. That war shattered the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, the central government that had, at least in theory, held the country together. Once that authority collapsed, power did not disappear. It simply scattered into the hands of dozens of regional warlords, known as daimyo, each commanding their own private armies and ruling their own territory as they saw fit. For the average villager, this fractured world created three distinct, overlapping fears that shaped daily life for generations. The first fear was conscription. Most daimyo armies were not made up entirely of professional warriors. A large portion of any Sengoku-era fighting force consisted of Ashigaru, low-ranking foot soldiers, most of whom were ordinary farmers pulled from their fields and handed a spear, a bow, or later, a matchlock firearm. If your lord needed men for an upcoming campaign, you might simply be told to report for duty, with little say in the matter. Farming families lived with the constant possibility that a son, a husband, or a father could be conscripted at any moment, with no guarantee he would return home. The second fear was economic devastation. When an army marched through a region, whether it was friendly or hostile, it needed to eat. Soldiers requisitioned rice, livestock, and supplies directly from local villages, sometimes leaving families with barely enough to survive the season. If a village happened to sit on a contested border or near a strategic road, it might be looted or burned entirely, simply because it was in the way. The third fear, and perhaps the most psychologically exhausting, was political instability itself. This era is often described using the Japanese term gekokujō, meaning those below overthrow those above. Vassals betrayed their lords. Retainers seized power from the very families they once served. A daimyo who ruled your region this year might be dead or replaced by next spring, and the loyalty of any given family or fortress could shift overnight. For a farmer, this meant there was no stable answer to a simple question: who governs me, and what do they expect from me? Many villages responded to this uncertainty with cold pragmatism, pledging support to whichever local lord offered the lowest taxes and the strongest promise of protection, fully aware that arrangement could change again within a year or two. Faced with a world this unpredictable, ordinary people did not simply wait passively for disaster. They adapted. Some villages built simple defensive structures, earthen walls, gates, and lookout points, allowing residents to spot approaching danger early and raise the alarm. In regions where central authority was especially weak, some communities went even further, arming themselves directly. The most striking example of this is the Ikko-ikki, a powerful alliance of Buddhist monks and farmers belonging to the Jodo Shinshu sect. Rather than relying on any samurai lord for protection, the Ikko-ikki built and defended their own fortified strongholds. Their resistance was serious enough that it became one of the greatest obstacles standing in the way of Oda Nobunaga's ambition to unify Japan, most famously during the 11-year siege of the Ishiyama Honganji fortress. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the rigid hereditary social order many people imagine when they picture feudal Japan barely existed yet at the start of this era. In the early Sengoku period, the line between samurai and farmer was far blurrier than most people assume. Many independent landholders moved fluidly between working the land and picking up arms when necessary. Ashigaru themselves began as little more than temporarily armed peasants, only gradually evolving into a more organized, semi-professional fighting class as the decades wore on. This blurred, chaotic social mobility produced one of the most remarkable rags-to-power stories in Japanese history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born the son of a peasant farmer, Hideyoshi began his career as a lowly Ashigaru foot soldier, one of thousands of anonymous conscripts just like the villagers we've been describing. Yet through a combination of ambition, strategic brilliance, and sheer force of will, he rose to become one of the three great unifiers of Japan, alongside Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu. His rise was not a freak accident. It reflected just how unsettled and fluid Sengoku society truly was, at least until the very structure that allowed men like him to rise was deliberately shut down. In 1588, having achieved enormous power, Hideyoshi enacted a policy known as the katanagari, or sword hunt. He ordered the mass confiscation of weapons from the peasant and farming classes across Japan, officially framed as a way to fund a great Buddha statue, but in practice designed to prevent further peasant uprisings and to permanently cement a rigid boundary between the warrior class and everyone else. The very ambiguity that had once allowed a farmer's son to become the most powerful man in Japan was, quite deliberately, being closed off for anyone who might try to follow the same path again. Hideyoshi also carried out a nationwide land survey, the Taiko Kenchi, standardizing land values and tax obligations, tightening the government's grip on rural life in ways that reduced flexibility for ordinary villagers even further. Meanwhile, warfare itself continued to evolve. Massive fortified castles rose across the countryside, built on stone foundations, surrounded by wide moats, capped with imposing wooden keeps known as tenshu. These were not just military strongholds. They were deliberate symbols of a daimyo's power, designed to be seen for miles, reminding every farmer in the surrounding valley exactly who held control over their land and their fate. Some historians describe Oda Nobunaga in particular as a master of psychological warfare, using fear itself, reputation, intimidation, and the visible power of fortresses like Azuchi Castle as a weapon just as effective as any army. By 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu had emerged as the final victor of this long, exhausting struggle, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate and ushering in over 2.5 centuries of relative peace. For the descendants of those frightened villagers who once heard warning bells ringing across the valley, the world they inherited would look almost unrecognizable, rigid, structured, and stable in a way their ancestors could hardly have imagined. There is something worth sitting with here. Natural disasters, a typhoon, a freezing winter, a sudden earthquake, arrive without malice. They are indifferent forces of nature, but the fear that defined the Sengoku period came from other human beings, from betrayal, ambition, and the simple, brutal reality that power abhors a vacuum. And yet, even inside that chaos, people still built defenses, formed alliances, farmed their land, and in at least one extraordinary case rose from nothing to reshape the entire nation. Human-made fear may be different from the fury of nature, but human resilience, it seems, responds to both in remarkably similar ways. If you had lived as a farmer during the Sengoku period,
Do you think you would have stayed loyal to a single lord no matter what?
or would you have shifted your allegiance to whoever promised the safest deal, the way so many villages actually did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most turbulent eras, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the fascinating story of mankind. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.